Right? If he's not trying to convince you that God isn't real anymore, he's trying to convince you that God is less than who he actually is. Right? And he does that in so many different ways. And I think even coming off of COVID, if we're off of COVID, I don't know if we're off or on or whatever, but wherever we are with COVID, you know, the whole point of that, I felt like, was to isolate us. Right? And there's just been a carry through of that isolation. Right? And most people now are working from home. Right? And it's such an easier thing to do, right? As if I'm a business owner, I'm not going to pay the overhead for this building anymore. I'm getting the same, if not more, production out of people by you staying at home. So stay home. Right? For so long we were doing school at home, and there's still some schools that are either hybrid or you're at home online. And so, you know, things like Instacart, where you don't actually have to go out to the grocery store to see people. Grubhub, I don't have to get up and go out to get food. I can actually just bring it home, and there's no interaction. There's no fellowship that way. And we are actually starting to lose patience, understanding, and empathy for each other, because we're so used to just being isolated on our own, doing our own thing. And I think there's a formula, I believe, for us to be able to live in the times that we're in and remain Christian. This is one of the hardest times to be a Christian right now. It's so difficult to even say you're a Christian. One, I think, you know, the church has done a number on people in the past, and they've made them feel guilty. They've been self-righteous. The church was accusatory and not loving, and not allowing the Holy Spirit to convict, but it was me, the church. I am going to take my megaphone and I'm going to convict you. And so there is that, and I think the pendulum is swinging, right, back to center, where you hear a lot more about love and empathy and being whole in the life of the church. But because there has been that animosity that the world has had now with the church, and the world has now found a voice to exercise and to say out loud their disappointment and their anger and sometimes even their hatred for the church. And so now you say you're a Christian, and before it was like people would roll their eyes, and now it's like, oh, you're one of them. And so there's a little more confidence in people to throw shade or sling mud at Christians, and I believe that I do. I think that this is a difficult time to be a Christian, but Jesus promised us that we would have to endure hard times. And if this is, listen, I don't think any of this is God's punishment, right? If we're living in the punishment of God, I'll take this all day, right? If we're living in the wrath of God, I'll take this all day. I think there's more to come, and I think the world is prepping and ramping up for really what the Bible talks about in the end times, about what we have to endure as Christians. But for now, what we have to do, I believe, are these three things. One, be in proximity. Two, be honest/vulnerable. And three, love. To me, they sound pretty simple, but when we look at them and we break them down, we can realize how difficult sometimes this can be. And when we talk about proximity, you know, this isn't anything new that I haven't shared before, is our proximity to God and our closeness to God and our relationship with Him, and how we build that relationship and how we foster our relationship with who God is, and how He walks and talks with us. To me, that's not anything new that you haven't heard me say, but I believe that it's crucial for our walk with God and how we're supposed to live in these times is that we have to have a close proximity to God. But we also have to have close proximity to one another. I love when I read the book of Acts and I see how the church just hung out together. They were together all the time. What they did together. Part of it was because of the persecution they were encountering, and so it was easier to be persecuted when you're all together. But also because they started seeing all the miracles and the wonders that God was doing through them. So much so that even in the height of their persecution, the church was growing. Why? Because they knew the power of having the presence of God, but they also knew the power of being together. I think with the world wanting to isolate us, we have to combat. We have to combat that. We have to come against that with the exact opposite of what the world is wanting and go in with what God is calling us to do, and that is be in my presence. And have a church that actually resembles family.
Yeah, good.
I think I learned this concept early on of church being family, in high school, because, and you can maybe relate to this even if you didn't go to a youth group, but sometimes your friends become closer to you than your family members, especially in high school. But something that I had in addition to that was a church friend group and a church family that became tighter to me in some instances than some of my own family. And I think in those times where I was going through maybe some of the roughest, maybe learning experiences that I've had to go through, I had people to lean on that understood, that could help walk me through. Right? And you think, oh man, and if you guys are in your 20s, you think it's rough. You guys that are teenagers, have fun. Like, it doesn't get easier, right? It's like I tell people with my kids that are older, the chaos is not less, it just changes. It just changes. And so as you get older, life lessons, you learn some, but then there's others that you still have to walk through. And why do you have to walk through those alone? Why should you have to walk through those alone? To me, I don't understand how non-church going people get through life. We have to be in proximity to one another. I think we have to be honest and vulnerable. There was this movement among men to where you don't show emotion. And they wanted to blame it on when you were a little kid, you got a Tonka truck and you crashed into things. You didn't get a Barbie in a playhouse or whatever. However it worked out for you, the reality is God created us with emotion. Right? And he wants us to actually understand and live out loud in our emotions and to express our emotions. And the more that we express our emotions, the closer we get to the people that are around us. The closer we get actually even to God. I want you to think about this. Think about Jesus with his disciples. And that's kind of what we're going to focus on this morning out of Scripture. Jesus with his disciples. He calls them specifically. Right? Fishermen, right? He calls Nathaniel, I saw you sitting under a tree. You're a man with no guile. He calls these people, he calls Matthew out. He calls all these different people out from where they are, and he calls specific people to do specific things with them. Then he spends time with them. Then he does ministry and life. Right? He becomes close enough to them after a while of walking with them that in Matthew chapter 17 verse 1, he takes 3 of them up to see the transfiguration. All right, Moses and Elijah show up and he's got these disciples there. You don't do that with just anybody. You do that with people that you've drawn close to. Think about the story of Lazarus in John chapter 11. And, they're like, Jesus, come, your friend is dying. And Jesus is like, all right, I'll get there. And he shows up the next day. And Lazarus is already dead. And here comes Mary, right? And if you read in chapter 11, verse 5, it talks about Jesus loved Lazarus, Mary, and his sister. He had love for them. Why? Because if you read throughout Scripture, every time he went anywhere that he traveled, that was his layover. It was with Lazarus and his sisters. And so there was proximity. It didn't matter where he went. If he went north or south, east or west, wherever he landed, he spent time with them. And so he had a heart for them. You talk about being vulnerable. Remember the disciples in Luke chapter 8. We can read that. Luke chapter 8, verse 22. And it says, one day Jesus said to his disciples, let's go over to the other side of the lake. Pretty simple, right? Jesus calls us and he calls us to go somewhere with him. And it sounds simple. It always starts off easy. We're all fired up because we heard God's voice and then we're going to go do it. And then we start going. And then they got into a boat and set out. And as they sailed, Jesus fell asleep and a squall came down on the lake that the boat was being swamped. Exactly. And they were in great danger. Isn't that like our walk with God? Right? We get in, we're going, it's all good. And we almost forget about Jesus in the process. We start doing it on our own, and all of a sudden the boat gets swamped. And we start to get afraid. So then, verse 24, the disciples went and woke him, saying, Master, Master, we're going to drown. And he got up and rebuked the wind, the raging waters. The storm subsided and all was calm. And he says, where was your faith? Where was your faith? You can read that in so many different ways, but what I'm looking and pulling out of that today is the fact that they were so close to Jesus that they could go to him and say, Jesus, I'm scared.
Yeah, good.
This doesn't look like what you promised me. This isn't as easy as I thought it was going to be. Why are you sleeping? Where are you? Come on. Where are you at, Lord? And what I realize is that when you have that kind of proximity, when you have that kind of close relationship with God, there's nothing you can't say to him. There's nothing we can't say to God. We think it and we try to make all these really articulate prayers to God, when sometimes we just need to share what's in our heart.
Yeah.
I don't understand this, God. I'm frustrated, God. I'm angry. And I'm angry with you sometimes, God, because I don't get why I'm in this place.
Yeah.
You don't think God hasn't heard it, and you don't think he's big enough to understand, and you don't think he's big enough to actually not be insecure about who he is, to actually just hear what you're saying. He can handle it. He can handle it, and it's okay. Think about these disciples of his. Jesus is talking about he's going to die. He's going to go into heaven in Luke 9. And then verse 45, they say, all right, well, Jesus, which one of us is going to be the best? He's talking about dying on the cross, and then they're just wondering about themselves. Reminds me of yesterday when Kanisha said, I go, I'm hungry. She says, I'm hungry too, and I made a sandwich. I made one sandwich. I just wasn't paying attention, and then I looked at her face, and I was like, oh, yeah, you wanted a sandwich too. Yeah, I'm trying to clean it up. But anyways, but we get so focused on ourselves that we forget about the bigger picture. Right? Well, Jesus is talking about something eternal, and these guys are worried about like the next couple of years. And forget, how many times does Jesus say, can you have faith? Can you have a little bit of faith? How many times he goes to God and he says, how much longer, Lord? How much longer do I have to be with these guys? When are they going to get it? That comes out of being vulnerable with one another. Right? That's Jesus being vulnerable with them. and them learning to be vulnerable to Him. We have to learn how to do that together too. How else do you build relationship? If you always got it together, if I have a problem, I can never go to you. Because how would you understand? How would you get my issue if you've never had one? If I'm walking into church every week and you just got the big smile on your face and, man, how can I come to you and say, man, I just feel sad? We've got to be able to be vulnerable with one another. The disciples got that, and also Jesus got that. Remember when Lazarus dies, what does it say? Shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. If that's not a man expressing his emotions, I don't know what is. We can't buy into what the world is trying to get us to buy. We just can't spend our dollars on what they're trying to sell us. We have to be willing to show emotion, or at least allow our weaknesses to be seen at times. And there's a willingness that we take to risk being hurt.
Yeah.
We would never have a relationship, any relationship ever, if we weren't willing to take the risk to be hurt. Well, you say, well, that's your job. That's your job, Darian. You're supposed to take that risk with people. It doesn't make it any easier, and it doesn't make it exclusive to me.
Good.
Right? As a pastor, oh man, people come and go, and you just got to be willing to deal with that. Well, I'm a person, and so I do have feelings and emotions. But so should all of us, right? I think if we can learn how to live in this space where we have close proximity to God and to each other, we're able to be vulnerable and honest. Then the last part of us loving becomes so much easier. It becomes so much easier. If we can, when we're close to one another, we develop that want and that desire to be vulnerable. And then automatically, man, we start to have these feelings of love for each other. Hopefully you guys have had this talk with your boys. If not, it's going to be fun. But think about your marital relationship. And if you're not married, listen to what I'm saying. If there's no proximity and there's no vulnerability in your relationship, you can have sex, but are you actually making love to each other? And that is such a crucial piece to our relationship. It's a crucial piece of our marital relationship. But if that vulnerability isn't there, if we haven't chosen to be close and to want to be around each other and to talk to each other and to share, then it's just an act. And there's no follow through of that love that's there, that should be there. And I think that's why there's so many broken young people. Because they end up maybe having some proximity, but there's no vulnerability. And so they end up giving themselves to someone else, and they end up brokenhearted, not trusting people, just constantly hurt, and then wanting to hurt other people. Because that's what hurt people do. Hurt people. But if we can learn that, no, there has to be this closeness, and there has to be this vulnerability that we have, and then we have the love that just is an overflow from that area, and now we have a relationship. In general, we have a relationship that's built on something more. And I don't know about you, but I want my relationship with God to be built on something more than just, yeah, I read a couple scriptures, or I went to church, or I said yes to Jesus a long time ago and I'm good to go. I want my relationship with God to be built on that proximity where I know him and he knows me. And I can tell him my fears and my concerns, and he can speak to those things, and I can, in a way that I can understand and live in freedom and in hope, with a desire to be with him. And hopefully we build that as an overflow of our relationship with God, we build that with each other. So I think that's where, as believers, we have to understand is that everything that comes out of our life is an overflow of our time with God. We can work as hard as we want to work. We can learn as much as we want to learn, and we can study as hard as we want. But the reality is, it's the overflow of our relationship with God that flows into all those other areas that allows us to be the best at what we do, to get the accolades that we want to get, to live in the freedom that we want to live in. I think if we can get those three things right, the closeness or proximity, the vulnerability and the love, then what we walk into is trueness. We walk into fidelity, where we're true disciples of God. Right? Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 16. I'm my beloved and he is mine. Right? That's true love for one another, but that's how we're discipled. I am his and he is mine. Like I said, the early church got that and they understood that. And what I want us to understand as a church is that we can live in that as well. In Acts chapter 2, verse 45. Everyone had what they needed.
Yeah.
Now we can think about that from a physical, material perspective, but also emotionally and spiritually, everyone had what they needed. No one had to go without. In our marriages, you've heard me say this, hopefully you've read it, is Ephesians 5:21. Submit to one another. Then husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Then wives, submit to your husbands. It starts and stems from submit to one another. We can do that when we're in proximity. We can do that when there's vulnerability, and we can do that when there's true love. Some of my favorite times of being with my kids is being able to share some of my story. Right? I had a little moment with both Olivia and Ethan this week, and you know, I'm not the handiest guy on the planet, but I'm working on this on our dining room table. I'm sanding it down and gonna, put a clear coat on there. It looks actually pretty good. The tabletop is the easiest part, right? It's when you get to the legs, because they're all contoured and they've got like these little thin like margins of creases, right? And so I'm out there and I've got this piece of sandpaper that's about that long, and I folded it in half, and I'm like, just like I'm shining a shoe almost. And literally, it took me hours to do one leg yesterday. But it looks amazing, if I say so myself. But I'm sitting out there, and Ethan comes, and it's like the greatest joy of my life. He comes and he brings me something to drink, and he sits down next to me, and we just start talking. And we start talking about this, we start talking about that, and then all of a sudden it just built up into this moment that we don't always get. But it's those moments that we desire, and so we take them, right? And why? Because we're close to each other. Maybe because he's in the house, but even not, because I'm getting this with Ezekiel in Chicago. We're close to each other. Then I'm vulnerable with him, and I'm telling him, hey, these are some of my stories. This is what I had to walk through. And him listening, and then not him just like, okay, cool, thanks, and taking off, but him replying back, and we're actually having this conversation. And that's how the love grows. Right? We all want eventually for us to go from being parents to being friends. Right? We'll never stop being parents, but hopefully we can transition to being friends with our kids. And I mean, I like my kids. I mean, I genuinely like them, not just because they're my kids. And listen, I would tell you the first thing if one of them needed to go, I'd tell you. Nah, he's cool, but nah, he's got to go. But we all want to make that transition at some point in time. And we can't make that unless we have those other three things working in tandem. But to me, that's kingdom. All of this is kingdom. This is what we're trying to build. This is what we're trying to grow. And this is what overcomes the world. If we can find that, then we live in security.
Yeah.
Knowing that we stand on solid ground. We can have peace in our lives, knowing who we stand with and who stands with us. Right? We can begin to trust, and we don't have to know everything, but everything we know is based on who we love and who loves us.
Good.
We find that we can be open to allow God to be God in our lives and allow the people in our lives to speak into our lives. Listen, the Bible's clear that we should get counsel. You can do this however you want. If I have an issue, I'm going to go to God and I'm going to pray. Okay, God, I need answers. And even when I get answers from God, I want to say, okay, I want to know that I actually heard God. And so I'm going to go talk to someone close to me to make sure, man, you think I'm hearing right. Because the Bible talks to us about getting counsel. It's not them telling me what to do, right? It's just getting their perspective. And maybe them saying something to me that I may not have thought of on my own. Or they actually are hearing God as I'm talking to them, and God speaks to them and puts something on their heart, and they tell me. That's allowing people access, right? And sometimes people get it right, and sometimes people get it wrong, and sometimes I don't listen to what people say. Because I know maybe they had an agenda while they were talking to me, and I'm not going to buy into that agenda. But we have to be open enough and willing enough to allow people to speak into our lives. And so, and when we do, we actually, I think, find empathy. We find empathy for each other. We have a greater understanding of who we're walking with and who we're talking to. And we can begin to share the feelings of others. Can I tell you, this is just my observation. You know, we went through all of what we went through in 2020. The pandemic, and then George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and all those different things that happened, and everyone was woke. Well, a lot of people said they were anyways. I think I was already, because I've already seen it, and I've bought that T-shirt and the CD. And so everyone wanted to be on this bandwagon of empathy and caring for each other and loving each other and trying to see other people's lives from their perspective and not mine. Can I tell you that's waning? And the reason why it's waning is because, one, it's not the thing that we see on the news all the time. But more importantly, and even probably more scary, is that the church isn't talking about it. The church isn't talking about the things that bring us together, that hold us together as a whole, not just as segments. Like your friend group, I would imagine, looks a little bit different than my friend group. And that's okay. It should look different. And what we should be asking and allowing ourselves to, as we have those friends and as we're close to proximity, right? We're being vulnerable and we're being honest with them. It's not just about being vulnerable. It's about being honest and telling them the truth. Yeah. And if we are the church and we're telling people the truth about who Jesus is and how Jesus acts and walks and treats people, then that doesn't wane. Then this idea of empathy doesn't go away. It actually is a continuum. And we actually begin to see more and more people, their eyes being opened and them wanting to come into a greater understanding of who God is as the blindfolds are being pulled off the eyes of their minds. But if we stop doing it, don't expect anyone else to do it. We can't expect the world or CNN or MSNBC or Fox or whoever you watch to be the heralds of truth. That has to be us. Good. And we can't just sit back and complain that it's not happening. We actually have to action it and do something about it. Proximity, honesty / vulnerability and love. That's how we make a difference in our world. That's how we maintain and actually advance in the kingdom of God. You bow your heads with me this morning.